Hey, welcome to another episode of Bitcash Breakthrough, your gateway to digital wealth. Please welcome Adam Miller, a trailblazer in the DAO space and the visionary CEO and co-founder of MIDAO. Under his leadership, MIDAO has distinguished itself by incorporating decentralized autonomous organizations in the Marshall Islands, making it the only sovereign jurisdiction that fully acknowledges the decentralized essence of DAOs. Adam's pioneering work includes authoring 3 laws passed in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which recognized the first sovereign nation DAO LLC. With a rich background in advising over 500 DAOs and collaborating with 100 DAO lawyers, Adam's insights are sought after globally. His dedication is evident in his forecast that DAOs will multiply tenfold over the next decade, predicting a future where DAOs surpass traditional legal organizations in number. He hosts the influential Just DAO It podcast, offering deep dives into DAO incorporation, regulation, and the future of decentralized governance. Adam is also an active voice in the DAO community, contributing to MIDAO, Emerald DAO, and Purple, and has spoken at major venues including ETH Denver and CoinDesk TV. He continues to shape the dialogue around DAOs and their role in our digital future. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
All right. So I also like to start out by asking, what got you into crypto or Bitcoin?
Yeah, great question. So in 2012, I read about the Silk Road in, I think, the New York Times. And the idea that there was this dark web, part of the internet that I had never heard of and didn't know how to access, was just mind-blowing to me as someone who's been obsessed with the internet since I was a little kid. And so I had to find it. And so I spent, it turned into the next years, but starting it with first few days and weeks, just trying to understand the dark web. I found the Silk Road, learned about Bitcoin as the payment method. I had to learn about Bitcoin. So I started just researching, how do you buy Bitcoin? Right? At the time, there were no exchanges. The only way to buy Bitcoin was to send, at least that I was aware of, was to send a Western Union. I remember sending a Western Union to this guy in Australia and trusting that when he got it the next day, he would send me the amount of Bitcoin he had promised to send me the day before. So that's when I got into Bitcoin in the first place. But it wasn't until really, like, I'd say around 2020 that I saw what was happening in the Ethereum ecosystem, that I really saw the crypto light and decided I needed to devote my life and career to advancing blockchain and crypto. And so that was seeing things like NFTs and DeFi and identity, on-chain identity, DAOs. That's when it hit me. And even though I had already been in Bitcoin for 8 years, that's when the crypto bug really got me.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how did you maybe, come across all of these new technologies on Ethereum, DAOs, NFTs? Was it any particular project you got involved with? And where did it click? Where, okay, we could talk about DAOs, but this seems to be where you went all in on, really, the idea of DAOs.
Yeah, so I was working for a company called Capital Group, which is a large global investment management firm. And my job was to do emerging technology research and share that research internally at the company so that everyone at the company would know what's happening in the world of emerging technology and how do we need to respond. And so I covered areas including blockchain and cryptocurrencies, cybersecurity, data science, and AI. And we were just always looking out at what was happening in the world, following trends, and then writing research internally, doing events and webinars and seminars, meeting with business leaders to explain things to them directly. And so part of my job was to be on top of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. But I would say still, it wasn't, I spent a few years doing that and still just seeing it as this kind of like sideline activity that we need to watch and I need to write about, but it doesn't need to change my life. And then I don't remember exactly why or how. I remember hearing about CryptoKitties. I remember being interested in that. I remember actually a few times trying to buy a CryptoKitty or do something with one. And for anyone who doesn't know, this was arguably the first NFT. It was at least the first NFT project that really took off. And I remember not being able to do it. I just couldn't figure it out. So I think at some point, maybe I finally came across, maybe it was OpenSea. I don't remember if OpenSea was around at the time, but I finally came across an NFT where it worked. And I was like, oh my God, wow. Like I just did this on-chain transaction. I just bought a property right. this could be anything. It could be any property right. It could be anything that you can imagine could be in this NFT. And just seeing that it actually worked pretty seamlessly at some point with my browser wallet. I was probably using MetaMask at the time. And so it was really just experiencing it for myself that shifted my mindset from this is just something I research professionally to this is going to change everything. And to your point about the question about DAOs, once I decided I was going to leave my job and get into crypto full time, I spent about a year researching everything happening in crypto, really trying to building market maps, everything from media and content and social media to layer ones and protocols and dApps to the different trends in crypto, whether that was privacy or ZK or DAOs or NFTs or whatever. And I researched all of it with an eye on trying to figure out what was the most exciting to me. Where did I want to have my impact? And so through that research, I came across DAOs for the first time. I joined some DAOs and it just clicked for me. I think given my own personal interest and passion around how humanity organizes itself on Earth and beyond potentially. And just thinking about, if you go back to, there's this book by Yuval Harari called Sapiens. I think it's pretty popular, especially in the tech community. And this book argues, not the first to argue this, but argues that what makes humans so powerful is clearly not our speed, our strength, our endurance. Like we can find animals that are stronger in those areas. It's our ability to organize. And first around like agriculture and then religion and then writing. And you can look at the history of how humans organize ourselves. When we find a new way to organize, let's say with kings and feudalism, or eventually democracy, like eventually companies and the joint stock corporation and limited liability companies. These innovations are the key things that drive humanity forward, not our speed, strength, endurance as physical beings. And so when a new technology came along, which is DAOs and everything we're building in the DAO ecosystem and industry, that I think promises to build a whole new platform for organizing ourselves, our resources, even our AIs and autonomous agents, right? This to me, it feels like it's a blank slate because it's so new, but it's a blank slate that's going to have such a huge impact on the way we do things as a species and beyond, as life on Earth and beyond.
Yeah, that's great how you describe that. And yeah, it's interesting to know that you came from a very top level institutional company, because I've heard of it back in my days in financial services, and you had more research positions. So it seems as though I could tell that you've dug in not only for the company, but for yourself afterwards, dug into a lot of in-depth research into these technologies. Do you have a legal background? It's impressive that you authored 3 kind of pieces of law. It seems that you've got a lot of research experience and skills there, but this is all about legal, right? Like a very legal space. So, and
great question. Yeah. I am not a lawyer. I have no legal background before starting this company and writing these laws, except that I've been an entrepreneur for most of my life, except for my stint at Capital Group. So I was a tech entrepreneur. I have previously started an incubator for tech companies. So I've raised money. I've always been this type of CEO, and I think a lot of CEOs are this way. I like reading my contracts before I sign them. Lawyers are amazing. And by the way, the 3 laws I've written, especially the most recent, most comprehensive law in the Marshall Islands that has done the most for Web3 and DAOs, was written collaboratively with lawyers all over the world, including in the Marshall Islands. So it's far from a solo effort. But the first law, we literally, the founding team, a few of us, including a senator in the Marshall Islands, who's not a founder of the company because he's still in the government. So there would have been a conflict of interest. But really, the writing of the law was collaborative between my co-founder, myself, this one lawyer on our team, and the senator at the time in the Marshall Islands. But no legal background until now. Again, except being an entrepreneur, which I think does give you a bit of a legal background. And I've also been surprised to see in the legal circles that I'm now in, not everyone's a lawyer. I mean, really, truly, not everyone's a lawyer. You have a lot of lawyers who maybe went to law school, maybe they practice law, but now they're business people. You also have a lot of people working in the field of law that are not lawyers. And so whether that's on the policy side, some very prominent policy people, politicians, right? A lot of them are not lawyers. They're writing laws. That's their job. They have teams of people who write laws. And so it's also been interesting to see. You also see companies like LegalZoom in the US, at least, Rocket Lawyer. I don't know if there's maybe hopefully international equivalents, but these are tech companies that solve legal problems for their users, right? So you could go to LegalZoom, you can leverage their technology to help you get a good contract drafted for some personal or business matter, and they charge you for it. They're not a lawyer. They're not your lawyer. Now, just like MIDAO, our company, uses lawyers to help do things the right way, LegalZoom presumably uses lawyers a lot to help them do things the right way. But there's this interesting opportunity to be a non-lawyer in the legal field.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I think there's a gap definitely between having to hire professional services at extreme cost and just giving some guidance and having more paralegal type of help. Walk me back through the process of Marshall Islands, like the three laws and maybe a little bit of the politics behind this. This is amazing that you were able to accomplish the first sovereign jurisdiction for DAOs. But how does that start? Like, where does it begin?
Yeah.
What was the process? And maybe you could explain a little bit about the three laws that were passed that you authored.
Yeah, so it all goes back to when I decided to leave my job, and I decided eventually I wanted to get into DAOs. I started a DAO tech company. And this DAO tech company, we had a few initial customers. These were DAOs that we were building tech solutions for. One of those DAOs was offered $1 million grant from the Moonbeam Ecosystem Fund. And Moonbeam said, to accept this grant, you need a legal entity for your DAO so you can sign the grant agreement. And so this was the first time we had come across this problem that it turns out a lot of DAOs, especially at the time, were facing, because most DAOs at the time had not formed legal structures of any kind, at least not adequate ones. And so we looked around the world, we started asking around. We looked at the Cayman Islands, which was very popular in crypto. We looked at Switzerland, we looked at Delaware and Wyoming, and came to the realization that every legal entity available in the world at the time, 3-ish years ago, would have forced us to make compromises that we thought were essential characteristics of being a DAO, that we did not want to make those compromises. For example, we didn't want to have a management team. We wanted to be able to have a legal structure that has no board, no officers, no trustees, no independent directors, no managers. Right now, I'm not saying no DAO should ever have managers or a board. That's fine if people want to consider how that fits in. But to have a legal structure that doesn't require it felt important to us. Another big thing was anonymity. So we had in our DAO, and we still to this day, and wanted to be able to have anonymous members who are truly part of the company once the DAO is formed as a registered company. So these were the two big things to us. And when we looked around the world, we couldn't find anywhere that would allow us to do either of those two things. And so we did some research on popular corporate jurisdictions. Turns out the Marshall Islands is one of the top 3 jurisdictions in the shipping industry. And so there are already like 40-ish New York Stock Exchange traded companies that are Marshall Islands companies. They're all jurisdiction in the Marshall Islands, and these are huge global companies. There are tens of thousands of companies registered in the Marshall Islands, all in the shipping industry, almost entirely in the shipping industry. And so we came up with a pitch for the government of the Marshall Islands. We went to a senator there it's a whole other story how we had met him, but a lucky coincidence. We went to the senator and said, hey, in some ways, DAOs are like ships. They don't live in any one place. They're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. How would you like to expand your country's expertise from shipping into DAOs and Web3? And so this kicked off first the drafting of a very short amendment that made it possible to register DAO LLCs in the Marshall Islands as nonprofits in a very kind of small way. This was back at the end of 2021. And then by the end of 2022, and it was after we formed the company then called MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO, and it's a partnership between the government and our company. So MIDAO then starts officially collaborating with the government of the Marshall Islands in mid-2022 and kicks off the drafting of the DAO Act of 2022 that passed in November of 2022. That was our kind of flagship law, because actually the DAO Act, it allowed for nonprofits and for-profits. It introduced a lot of additional concepts into the law that were not in our original amendment. And then finally, so that was great. But at the time, we were still very small. So by the time we passed the DAO Act of 2022, the end of 2022, we probably had 10 or 15 registered DAOs in the Marshall Islands. 2023 became our early growth phase, where we went from, let's say, 10 or 15 to more like registered DAOs. And we raised our first fundraising round. And as we went along 2023, we also started bringing lawyers on board from all over the world. And so we would find let's say we had a prospective client who was thinking about creating a DAO LLC, but they decided to go with a Cayman Islands foundation. We went to that lawyer and said, okay, we want you involved in drafting the next law so that we can make the Marshall Islands better for your next client, so that you could choose the Marshall Islands instead of the Cayman Foundation. And then we found lawyers who were leading crypto lawyers and all kinds of different topics from all over the world. So the law that passed at the end of 23, now I consider that our flagship. That was an amendment on the DAO Act. And it was actually by far the most comprehensive, because we finally had lawyers from all over the world weighing in and saying, hey, there's this problem with the way this is written, or there's this potential loophole. If you read these 3 different laws and it's not 100% clear, what would a DAO have to do in this situation? All that stuff, we now put it into this amendment so that the DAO Act, as amended after the 3rd law, is just a groundbreaking crypto law in the world. It's absolutely, there's nothing like it anywhere else. And that's where we're at today. So now going forward, every year, we'll hopefully pass new laws and regulations that continue to drive things forward. And so now we have about 175 DAOs that are registered in the Marshall Islands or in the process of their registration, and thinking about how to grow from hundreds to thousands now.
Yeah, congratulations. It's such a short time span. And we're talking a few years to get to not only legislation passed, which typically takes many years, and to attraction, and it's great. It seems like there is a huge demand for it, which is great. What were some of the details around, let's say, Cayman Islands and other jurisdictions? What were there any other kind of, for the amendments you had, kind of the most recent? What were some of the big things that were in Cayman Islands where it was like not there in Marshall Islands? And also, what do you say to people who are creating Cayman Islands foundations, or let's say Panamanian foundations? Or so what would you say? What's your pitch?
Sure. Yes. The problem with most foundations is not the country that they're in necessarily, it's that they're foundations. And a foundation is a very specific corporate structure that has a board of directors or trustees. And that board can sometimes be as small as 1 person. You can hire an independent person to do it, which sometimes actually is required by many of these jurisdictions, actually is required. And so now you have a DAO that has a board. And some of these jurisdictions are even taking steps to reduce the power and even change the title of that board. In some cases, calling the person a supervisor. But still, if you think about, even just at face level, most DAOs that are truly trying to be decentralized will probably cringe when they hear we're going to be a DAO with a board, right? It's something already doesn't sound right when you hear that. Now, the reason for that is that DAOs want to be autonomous and decentralized, right? It's in the name. And you start to lose autonomy if you have a person or a group of people on a board that actually has to sign off on the DAO's decisions, right? It's like DAO decides we want to do X. Now the board gets to decide if the DAO actually does X. Suddenly that just doesn't sound like a DAO anymore in a lot of ways. Relatedly, there's that decentralization aspect too, right? Now there's different ways of defining what a DAO is and what do the words mean in DAO, but I think a lot of people use the word decentralized to mean not just the underlying technology, that it's on a blockchain, that you're using the blockchain for your organization, but that often the social structure, the power structure is decentralized. And sometimes that's important for securities law related reasons as well, that you don't have a central group of people anyone can point to. And so now if a DAO with that mindset needs to implement a board of directors that's at the center of everything and actually gets to decide if everything happens or not, that the DAO decides it wants to do, that's the problem. And so we see all the time. Just last weekend, I think it was Uniswap Foundation had been planning on holding a vote, and then at the last minute said, you know what, we're not going to do the vote because here's the reasons. To some people in the community, it's, wait a second, I thought this was a DAO. I thought anyone could submit a proposal and then we could do it anytime. And that if we decide we want to do something, we get to do it. No, the foundation, because the foundation is tied to the DAO, it has the final say. And so that's the number one thing. We could get into a lot of other like little legal nuances, and I'm happy to, of different jurisdictions. There's also, maybe I'll mention one other thing, which is cost. So the Cayman Islands and Switzerland and many other jurisdictions require you to hire a local independent director to sit on that board. Now, that can be your whole board if you want, but the fact that you have to hire a local person to actually sit on your board means you're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars a year in additional fees to maintain your entity, not to mention paperwork. What does this person have to do, document and sign, and how does that relate to the DAO? So all that extra work and cost that you just don't have in the Marshall Islands is probably the second big thing that comes up for when you're looking at comparing it to the foundation model.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I always wondered maybe there hasn't been any major kind of news about the board misbehaving, but that's always a risk, right? So it does, I'm sure, make people uneasy that there is a almost like an external board member that can really affect the DAO. Okay. And then, so let's go to another question about just DAOs in general. There's a lot of people that just probably start jurisdictionless, I would assume. There's probably, I would say, probably 1,000 or thousands of jurisdictionless DAOs, I assume, right? Just floating around. And so what's your pitch to them? Okay, so they're like doing things, and I know there's been a recent case in the US with MIDAO, I believe, and they're, I think, treating or potentially treating DAO members as general partners. So yeah, maybe you can explain a little bit about that and what you would tell just these jurisdictionless DAOs.
Yeah. So look, here's the hard truth. And the hard truth is that there is no option of being entityless or not tied to jurisdictions. The jurisdictions have a default treatment for any group of people engaged in a common enterprise that has not selected its own legal structure and jurisdiction. And that's called a general partnership in most places in the world. And so, yeah, to the point of UkiDAO, the first thing they said was, okay, they don't have a legal form, so we're going to treat it as a general partnership. And they have people all over the world, including in California. And so we're going to take them under California's jurisdiction. And it was that easy. There was no debate, no argument about it. No one would argue either of those things. Lawyers have been saying for years exactly what we tell people, which is that's going to be the default treatment, is that if you don't choose, they will choose for you. And they will choose general partnership, which is generally you're going to be the worst. Sometimes it actually makes sense. There are cases where that's what people want, but in most cases, that's not what you want. And so not choosing a jurisdiction actually puts you under every jurisdiction, and not choosing a corporate form in any jurisdiction gives you the worst default treatment under the law. And yeah, that's the message, unfortunately, to most DAOs that don't have a legal entity is you actually do have one. It's just the worst one, and it's the default one. And so the question is, do you want that? Or do you want to actually go out and try to pick one yourself so that you can, if you play your cards, you can get that legal entity's treatment? I'm not saying that's a perfect way of avoiding California courts putting you under their jurisdiction. They can take companies all over the world and find ways to put them under their jurisdiction. But it's at least a step you can take, is to try to choose your jurisdiction, your corporate entity type, and then do all the other stuff your lawyers are hopefully going to tell you to do to continue to manage risk related to whatever business it is you're engaging in. So I think that's the biggest thing. I will say this, I think there are two types of DAOs. There's DAOs that are just trying to follow laws and regulations. They just want to build their business, build their product, achieve their mission, have their fun, whatever their goal is. And they're happy to pay their taxes. They're happy to register. They're happy to have some of their founders do KYC, or some members do KYC and tell the world who they are. And that's probably a majority of DAOs. And I think that's great. And those are the types of DAOs we're going to be working with. There is also, and that any government will be working with. There's also the idea of DAOs as a censorship resistant technology. Like crypto is to money, or Bitcoin is to money, DAOs are to organizations, in that it's a way of organizing people and resources that the government cannot stop you from doing. It physically cannot stop you because you can do it on the blockchain. That doesn't mean they're not going to try to show up at your house with a machine gun and cause other problems for you. But it just like it's hard today to buy Bitcoin in the United States, at least, without having to give a bunch of information to the government. They found a way to do it. Even though technically you can use Bitcoin, no one can stop you. They found a way to make it hard. But that said, this idea that DAOs can be a form of censorship resistant organization without a legal entity, without a jurisdiction, because that would defeat the purpose, I respect that. And I think that's a really interesting and important technology. I love to use the example of the Canadian trucker protests. I don't know if that's too old now to be relevant. It's been a couple of years. These truckers in Canada were protesting, it's something related to COVID, maybe COVID lockdowns, and the Canadian government froze their bank accounts. And at the time I was thinking, and they were having trouble like buying food, drinks, water. I thought this would be a great opportunity for a DAO, a decentralized organization that people could donate money to. The truckers could collectively vote on how to use the money, maybe set up food stands or whatever. And the Canadian government could not stop them from doing it. And so there is this class of DAOs, which is like censorship resistant, subversive, revolutionary DAOs, that's great. They're not going to want to register anywhere, and it's fine. It's probably for the best. Their whole point is to avoid the connection to the government. But for 99% of the DAOs that are out there, I think they're just looking for fair treatment under the law, just like other industries get fair and reasonable treatment. And that's what places like the Marshall Islands or other registering in other jurisdictions might be able to help them achieve.
It makes sense. It makes sense. The other piece of it is what kind of maybe structures have you seen, maybe in terms of the for-profit, nonprofit? I think that's also a kind of probably a major issue. For example, Uniswap, I guess SushiSwap. So Uniswap really had to change their economics to, at least recently, to share the exchange fees to the token holders. Otherwise, people are saying it's just a governance token, and where's the value flow, right? The economic value flow for that. So it's a good example to address, okay, what's a for-profit, what's a nonprofit? And now I think the SEC, because they did that, they went after Uniswap. So how do you see that situation? How do you see the, let's say, organizations architect themselves to maybe have this economic, like tokenomics, where there's some sort of economic flow into the members compared to it being just purely just like a governance token? How do you address that one?
Yeah, so I think this question of for-profit versus nonprofit is a really interesting one. And there's also a wrinkle that emerges in the world of crypto that never existed before. And Uniswap's actually a good example for talking about that. But first of all, generally speaking, what's the difference between nonprofit and for-profit? And again, this is technically jurisdiction independent, just very specific legal treatment that gets very nuanced. But generally speaking, for-profits are allowed to make money and then distribute the profit to their owners, which could be token holders if it's a DAO. Nonprofits are also allowed to make money, but they are not allowed to distribute that profit to their owners. They have to spend that money towards achieving their mission. And that could include paying for contributions, intellectual property, vendors, even the token holders themselves could generally receive fair compensation for their work. But then nonprofit's not allowed to take that money and pay it out to its owners. So that's where in the traditional world, most businesses are left thinking, okay, I can either pick one or the other or do both, right? Some organizations have a nonprofit arm and a for-profit arm, and you just have to think about where does the right activity belong, and everything you want to put into that for-profit bucket is going to get taxed. And then with foreign foundations and the right use of a US nonprofit when possible, you can have it so that the nonprofit doesn't pay taxes and the members don't pay taxes, right? If you think about like nonprofit charities you may have donated to, right? They're generally not paying taxes on their income, and you're not paying taxes if you're a volunteer or you sit on their board, which is similar to holding a token in a nonprofit DAO. Now, here's the interesting wrinkle. Let's say that Uniswap Foundation is a nonprofit, which I think it is. Okay, it's not allowed to distribute profit to token holders. It cannot do that unless it's paying them for contributions. But that's a little bit different from what they're doing, which is they're turning on the fee switch from the protocol itself. So these smart contracts that live on the blockchain that, yes, are connected to the foundation in some way. Like the foundation is paying for the development of these contracts, marketing them, maybe building the front end for them. But still, the foundation is not accounting for those entities as if it's not accounting for those smart contracts, which you could call unregistered entities. They're these, right, entities living on the blockchain that have money flowing through them all the time, liquidity pools, AMMs, money's flowing through them. If that protocol wants to then directly pay a fee to token holders or through some other smart contract that's outside the foundation's treasury, that's fine. That's not going to make the foundation a for-profit, because the foundation is not making a profit and then distributing the profit to owners. It's the protocol that's paying those same token holders. Now, yes, at some point our government's going to say, wait a second, if it's the same people, let's look at this a little bit more closely. Yes, but again, that's not a novel thing. You have for-profit and nonprofit companies in the traditional world, TradFi world, traditional world, where they have the same or similar owners. That's not against the law. You just have to follow certain practices to make sure the two entities stay appropriately at arm's length, that deals between the entities are done properly. So I don't see there being necessarily a problem with this new crypto model where you have three kinds of things. You have nonprofits and you have for-profits, and you have entity-less smart contracts living on the blockchain that money might be flowing in and out of in a way that relates to your whole ecosystem, but does not necessarily affect the for-profit or nonprofit status or the books and accounting of the actual legal entities.
Yeah, that's great. That's great insight. And there's always a gray area in the law. And it makes sense. You could make the argument if I put the kind of the pro like nonprofit side and say the staking their assets and they're just getting rewarded for that. And it's again, it's not the entity, but really I think they're getting paid like a reward that a nonprofit would pay for services, let's say, for example. You can make that argument, I think. Right? It's like,
That is,
the-
yeah, I'd say that's squarely in a gray area. Yes, where
yeah,
lawyers can be valuable and business people can also make these decisions themselves if at their
yeah,
discretion. But yeah, if you're paying a staking reward, are you compensating someone for doing something, or
yeah.
is that what if all the owners are all staked 100% and now they're getting paid as if it were a dividend and the staking were irrelevant? I don't know. I think that's, I have heard some lawyers say that's the key, is that the staking is in some way distinct from ownership. And if you have 5 owners of what's supposedly a DAO and they all stake their 20% stake and they all get 20% of the profit, yeah, any government's going to say, like, this is clearly just like a for-profit endeavor with 5 people. You're just pretending to be a nonprofit. Versus if you have an ecosystem with millions or hundreds of thousands of users and you have 200 token holders and half of them are staked and the stakers are receiving rewards that look a bit like dividends, but they're not, because there really is a reward for staking and the owners of the entity who are not staking are not getting rewards. So yeah, definitely a gray area.
Yeah, okay. So case by case basis, talk to a lawyer. This is not legal advice.
Yep.
But that's great to know that there are gray areas and wrinkles that people can explore for themselves. Because I think that's going to be those that are willing to explore that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to get a more cost effective jurisdiction like Marshall Islands. All right, so maybe you could give a little bit. There's so many things we could talk about, but maybe you could give an idea of the types of DAOs that or the variety of DAOs you've helped with, just to give people ideas. So if they have an organization, it's probably to see the ones that are similar to theirs set up.
Yeah. So I would say that the 2 strongest patterns in who we see at MIDAO in terms of the DAOs, one is that they do tend to be building something in Web3 or crypto. It could be a layer 1 blockchain, could be they're building dApps and tooling, a lot of DeFi, a lot of DEXs, other protocols that are doing stuff on chain. So while our vision for the world is a little bit more that every organization should consider using DAO technology. And for example, even if you're starting a local restaurant, you might want to tokenize and do on-chain governance because it's better, cheaper, safer, faster than doing it only with traditional legal documents. So I believe that strongly. But to date, yes, most of our DAOs are either currently or planning on building something for crypto. The second pattern is that most of our DAOs are startups, and not all. We have some top 100 crypto projects that have created legal entities with us, Pith, GMX, Clipper, but it's mostly startups. And the reason for that is if you think about a traditional legal entity business, right? We're a registered agent. That's what our type of business is called. Usually, most people know that when you start a company, one of the first things you do is create the legal entity for it, right? We've seen it on TV. We see it in Silicon Valley TV show. We see it on Twitter, right? Everyone just knows when you start a company, you go create an entity for it. In some countries, it's actually required by law. The United States is actually a place where anyone's allowed to just start doing business anytime. And then we have this like default general partnership treatment. In some countries, you're not allowed to start conducting business until you've registered with the state. But either way, everyone knows that it's one of the first things you do. I think for some reason with DAOs, we started thinking it just felt like a different part of our life. It didn't feel like I was starting a company. It felt like I was hanging out with people in a Discord and doing cool stuff. And yeah, sure, there's money involved, but we didn't think of ourselves as a business or a charity or an association or any of those traditional things, only to find out later that we really were. So now that people starting DAOs know that you need to think about your legal structure from the beginning. Most of our clients are startups. It's 1 or 5 or 20 people starting a DAO. They're at the stage where maybe they've received funding or they have investors committed, or maybe they're just going out and preparing to raise money or do a token launch or something. And so that's what a lot of our clients are. They're at that early stage of development as a DAO. And that's also, by the way, if you look at the data on how many DAOs there are, most of them, there's a lot more than, if you look at, let's say you go to DeepDAO and you say, show me all of the confirmed on-chain DAOs that have meaningful size treasuries and governance activity, and it's all on-chain. Probably like 5,000, probably 5 or 10,000. That's the number they've used for a while. But now if you go to DAObase.ai, I think it is, where they're tracking every single DAO that's created with any DAO creation tool, including Snapshot, including things like DAO House, including others, you actually have like hundreds of DAOs being created a week and something like 170,000 plus DAOs in existence in total. But you don't know, like some of those, it's just like one or two people in a garage or a bedroom or office that were like, let's start a DAO. And the first thing they did was go on Snapshot and create a space or launch a token. It's probably not going anywhere, right? Most of the time when that happens, that maybe in a week, the idea fizzles out. Well, they already launched their Snapshot or their on-chain activity because it's so cheap and easy to do that they just did it, right? And so a lot of the DAOs we work with, they're not that early necessarily, but I think there is this range of, yes, there are some of the big DAOs we can all point to, but the majority of DAOs that are out there today are startup DAOs.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned though, some of these already have launched their token and now maybe they have some traction and they're wanting more of a real entity to support their project. And the other thing too is just recently I've been trying to figure this out though, is that some of these structures are where you have the foundation and you have a token issuance entity in another jurisdiction. So with MIDAO, is it just one entity? You don't have to do this, or did they allow public sales with MIDAO?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that's one of the crazy things that people have been doing for several years is they'll create a Cayman sandwich where you're using like a Cayman Islands entity and a British Virgin Islands entity and often a Delaware entity, and you're using them all for different purposes. And so like you use the Cayman Foundation because you like the foundation there, but then you do the BVI Foundation because it's allowed to launch a token. From a Marshall Islands perspective, that's insane. Like we absolutely do not want people creating multiple entities just to do that. And not to mention, if at some point the US government or any government really wanted to, they just look at that scenario and say, you're just faking it. You just literally created one company completely owned by another company just so you could do this thing in one place instead of another place. It's like clearly kind of, I don't know, trying to get around following the rules, or go to a place like the Marshall Islands where no, you're just allowed to do it. Right? You have an entity in the Marshall Islands. That's the entity you actually own or govern. And that entity launches its token and does what it's going to do with its token. So there are some things that are not allowed. Today, we don't allow VASPs. And so VASPs are something that's defined differently in different places. That shouldn't automatically scare someone away. If the British Virgin Islands told you you're a VASP according to their laws, you still want to go look at the laws of the Marshall Islands. In the Marshall Islands, it really has to do with custody other people's virtual assets. So if you're like a bank or an exchange, that's what makes you a VASP. So there are some things that are not allowed. But yeah, when it comes to basic using a token to track equity or governance rights, if it's a nonprofit, absolutely allowed. And we have DAOs every week probably that are launching a token.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. And VASP, just to be clear, is maybe you can describe it again. And it's typically for organizations that custody assets, but that's different than, I would say, what DAOs that have a treasury, right? So it's like usually a multi-sig, right?
Yeah,
So,
if you think about the difference between making an investment in a company and using FTX, let's just use FTX, right? When you use FTX, they're holding your money for you. And so that's why they got in trouble for losing that money, stealing that money. If on the other hand, you had invested in a company and now that company has a treasury, right? Maybe just in a bank account, that's not your money anymore. If they lose that money by making bad investment decisions or lending it to themselves or whatever, yes, still, of course, if they commit fraud, they're going to get in trouble. But like they can lose all that money and you have no recourse. Right? It was not your money the second you invested it in that project. So similarly, if you're part of a DAO and you've either bought the token, which represents governance rights or ownership rights, or you bought an NFT and contributed money to the DAO, that's not your money anymore. And that's why they're not custodying it for you, because it's not yours, it's theirs. You might own part of the DAO, but it's not your money, it's the DAO's money. And so that's not custodying. Similarly, if there's a protocol involved, like again, let's use the Uniswap example. That's why the Uniswap Foundation is not a VASP. Even though the Uniswap protocol has a bunch of money in it, the protocol, you could argue, is custodying the money, or maybe you just don't use the word custody and say the money is sitting in smart contracts, it's sitting in the protocol, right? No one's custodying it, certainly not the Uniswap Foundation. And so you can be a DAO that has money, including virtual assets. You can govern and manage and build a DEX. In either of those scenarios, that does not make you a VASP. What would make you a VASP is if literally your business were telling people, and then of course, or just doing it, but like telling people, give us your money, we will hold it for you and do something with it for you. Whether that's trading, whether that's giving you interest for it, right? But that's the key element. Is someone saying, I'm going to hold your money, but it's still your money? Or are you simply giving the money to them permanently, in which case it's not a VASP?
Yeah, that's great. Great. Thanks for the clarification. And there's a lot of stuff we covered, and we could probably do multiple episodes on this, and hopefully we'll have you back. Is there anything in particular you want to share about either MIDAO or anything else in this space that you just want to share to everybody?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say, look, a couple
Yeah.
things. One is that we have this network of partners, including lawyers all over the world that are DAO lawyers, DAO tax advisors, DAO business advisors. And there's no cost if you just want to reach out to us for an introduction to our network. We don't get paid for it. We just like helping connect lawyers and projects. And so if that's something you need, or if you're a lawyer and you're listening to this, please get in touch about being added network so that we can bring you referrals when there's a good fit for what you offer. That's the first thing. The second thing is come find me on Farcaster. If anyone listening is not on Farcaster yet, it's so much fun. It's still very early to be in what will hopefully be the social network of the future that takes over from X and Facebook and Instagram and everybody else. But in the meantime, it's a fun Web3 social network full of Web3 people and creatives. And I'm on there at The Thriller, which is where you can find me everywhere. Twitter, I'm 0xThriller. You can find MIDAO. We have a DAOs channel /DAOs on Farcaster, where it's just DAO people talking about DAOs, giving each other advice, asking each other questions. We do a weekly call for that space every Thursday morning in Pacific time. So would love to see people there as well.
That sounds great. That sounds great. And you also have a podcast, right?
And definitely check out the podcast. Yeah, I always forget to promote the podcast, but we're actually going to be doing a series of 5 or 6 episodes in the next month and a half after taking a bit of a hiatus. So the Just DAO It podcast for people starting DAOs. Every episode we cover recent DAO news. And then we also go into an in-depth interview with our guest. What's their background in Web3? What do they do in the DAO space? What are they seeing DAOs doing right and wrong? What needs to improve? So really awesome sessions, especially for anyone who's new to the space.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, definitely. And it'd be great for me to catch up with all your past podcasts, and we'll put the Farcaster link on the description of the video. But really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Kind of a wealth of knowledge, especially in this incredible DAO space. So glad to have you here, and hopefully you come back soon, and we can talk more about the latest with DAOs.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care, Adam. Really appreciate it.